CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Lynda Kinkade. We will return to Washington for more on the impeachment hearing in just a moment, but we do have some breaking news just into you. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to face charges today. Oren Libermann joining me now from Jerusalem after 3 years of corruption probe. Just bring us up to speed with what you're hearing.
Israel's Attorney General just unveiled charges against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a charge of bribery in one case, as well as a charge of fraud and breach of trust in that case, as well as 2 others. This marks the first time in Israel's history that a sitting prime minister faces criminal indictment, and that is a major blow to the personal and political future of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. This is an ongoing case that we've followed for years now, as the investigations have slowly advanced to this critical moment where the Attorney General has unveiled the charges. There were pre-indictment hearings as Netanyahu's high-powered legal team tried to get some of these charges dropped, crucially the biggest charge of bribery. But with the Attorney General's announcement today, we now know that he has upheld the charges he was pursuing and that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will face charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust as this moves forward. Now, we expect a statement from Attorney General Avichai Mendelblit in about an hour, and then shortly after that, we'll get a statement from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't think it'll come as too much of a surprise what we hear from Netanyahu, because he's been working to essentially delegitimize the campaign against him, the investigations against him, ever since they were made public. He has said they are a media-fueled witch hunt and says the investigations are conducted in an unfair fashion because of the leaks. As we've drawn closer to this date, we've seen him and his allies increase their rhetoric against the judiciary, including his justice minister, who said there was a state prosecutor's office within the state prosecutor's office that was acting politically, leading to a rare rebuke from both the Attorney General and the state prosecutor. Let's go through these cases for a moment so we have a better grasp on the charges Netanyahu is facing. In the biggest case against the prime minister, known as Case 4000, prosecutors say Netanyahu had an all-too-cozy relationship with a multimillionaire friend and business owner, Shaul Elovich. In that relationship, prosecutors say Netanyahu advanced regulatory benefits worth hundreds of millions of dollars for Elovich in exchange for favorable news coverage in a news website controlled by Elovich. It is in this case that prosecutors say Netanyahu will now face charges of bribery and fraud and breach of trust, which is a single charge, fraud and breach of trust. Netanyahu here has said all of the decisions he made in regard to this company and his friend were made with professional considerations and were made on the advice of experts. That being said, he has proclaimed his innocence since the beginning, and crucially, his lawyers were trying to get the bribery charge dismissed. It is the most serious charge. The Attorney General has upheld that charge. In the other 2 cases, known as Case 1000 and Case 2000. Case 1000 involves Netanyahu's relationship with multi-billionaire overseas businessmen. Prosecutors say he got what they call a supply line of gifts from 2 overseas businessmen, and they say that was a breach of trust, and that is the charge he faces here. Again, Netanyahu proclaiming his innocence. Finally, in Case 2000, prosecutors say Netanyahu was in talks with the owner and publisher of one of Israel's largest daily newspapers. They say in exchange for more favorable coverage, Netanyahu promised he would work to limit the circulation of that paper's rival. Again, here, Netanyahu has proclaimed his innocence. He will face a charge of breach of trust. Crucially, a question is, how does this deal with Israel's political deadlock, which has been going on for months now? And the answer is, it may not move it at all. There were certainly political actors here who were waiting to see in which direction this would go and what decision the Attorney General would make. Whether this is a big enough decision to shift any of the politicians here to support either Gantz, who is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rival, or Netanyahu himself, at this point seems unlikely. But it was a big decision that everyone was waiting for, and we'll see how the political deadlock shakes out from here. Likely, it may not move at all, leaving Israel in the same situation, politically at least, that it's been in for quite some time now. Crucially, there is one thing worth noting. Netanyahu has not yet been formally indicted, and that process might take months. Why is that? Because here's how the process is supposed to work. The Attorney General, Avichai Mendelblit, informs the Speaker of the Knesset that one of the parliamentarians, in this case Benjamin Netanyahu, will be charged. Netanyahu has a right, as does any other parliamentarian, to request parliamentary immunity, and he does so from the House committee. Only after that process can an official indictment be filed. But because there is such political deadlock, there is no House committee. and a formal indictment cannot be filed against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, meaning, at least for now, time is on Netanyahu's side. And this process, the legal process from this point on, could drag out for quite some time, months, I suspect, well into next year. But crucially, the big news today from Israel's Attorney General Avichai Mendoblit is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be the first sitting prime minister in Israel's history to face criminal charges. He will be faced with the charges of bribery in one case, and then fraud and breach of trust, which is a single charge in all three cases. Lynda, we expect a statement from Netanyahu in about an hour and a half from now or so. We will certainly keep you posted on that, as well as what we learned from the Attorney General's statement as well.
Oren, we are just looking at those live pictures of the podium where we are expected to hear from the Attorney General in less than an hour. And as you say, after that, we will hear from the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. In terms of his political future, you did say that from the get-go, he has proclaimed his innocence. He has called this corruption investigation a witch hunt. In terms of his political future, from my understanding, even when indicted, he isn't legally he won't be forced to resign, but how much pressure will there be on him to step aside?
Under Israeli law, a prime minister who is indicted doesn't have to step down until he is indicted, convicted, and that conviction is upheld through the entire appeals process, which could take years. As for the political and public support he has, there's no doubt that those who don't support him, and certainly opposition lawmakers, will call on him to step down. They've done that before, but he has repeatedly refused those calls in the past, and he's almost certain to do so once again. Crucially, Netanyahu has united his own Likud party behind him, as well as the other religious Zionist and ultra-Orthodox parties. They expected, perhaps, that some indictment would be coming, whether or not it includes the more serious charge of bribery, and that loyalty they've shown him may well be factored into essentially a pledge of support they've given him. So even with an impending criminal indictment, that may not shake the right-wing's support for Benjamin Netanyahu. It is worth noting that two members of Netanyahu's own Likud party have said they back primaries, which would be a leadership challenge to Netanyahu. But until that call grows louder, until that leadership challenge to Netanyahu grows louder, he can rest assured, at least for now, at least for a bit, that he is still in charge of his party and still prime minister.
So these scandals, of course, have not just engulfed him, but also his family, his wife, and his inner circle, some of which have testified against him, right?
Crucially, this is what's known as Case 4000, the biggest of the cases in which Netanyahu faces a charge of bribery and the single charge of fraud and breach of trust, which, again, in Israel is a single charge. In that case, prosecutors say that some of those closest to him, including the Director General of the Communications Ministry, whom he appointed, as well as his family's spokesman, were involved in the relationship between Netanyahu and the multimillionaire businessman and the back and forth there. Two of those key people there, both the Director General of the Communications Ministry and his former family spokesperson, turned state's witness, providing crucial evidence in this case against the Prime Minister. And that is what a lot of this is based on, it would seem. And we'll learn more about that and the decision process that went into making that when we hear from the Attorney General and as we go through the 63-page statement that came out today.
And in terms of the Attorney General, this was someone that worked on in Netanyahu's cabinet. What else can you tell us about him? Because he was handpicked for this particular post, and people were wondering how this would all play out, given his close relationship with the Prime Minister. But in recent times, it seems that Netanyahu's people, his aides, have seemingly attacked this Attorney General during this decision-making process.
Attorney General Avichai Mendoblit has been attacked from probably every side that's possible within Israel. Those who oppose Netanyahu, who want Mendoblit to move faster, and he's certainly moved at a sort of deliberate, methodical pace over the course of the past 3 years. And those who oppose Netanyahu, who want him, or rather those in favor of Netanyahu, who say he's moving too fast and moving with political considerations. But if you look at his past, he served as Netanyahu's cabinet secretary. He was Netanyahu's choice for Attorney General. He's a Netanyahu appointee. And he, from what we can see on the outside, did everything in his power to work through this process as slowly and as methodically as possible to get to this point. He will certainly now face criticism that this was a political decision. Let's go to the political background here. Since the September elections, Netanyahu has failed to form a government, Gantz just failed to form a government, and now we're in a 21-day period where any member of Knesset who can get majority support from Israel's parliament can be prime minister. He will probably be attacked because this could be interpreted as a political move to throw his support behind somebody that's not Netanyahu. regardless from what we have seen from the decisions he's made and how this process is drawn out, Mandelblit, the Attorney General, has tried to make this as slow, deliberate, methodical, and careful as possible to get to this point.
Oren, Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. This is going to be a huge fall from grace, and obviously it could be the end of his political career. But if convicted on these charges, he could actually face prison time.
Yes, there's no doubt these are serious charges, even without the charge of bribery. The single charge of fraud and breach of trust is itself a serious charge, and bribery only adds to that. It is certainly too early to call this a fall from grace or to say this is the end of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The fact is, ever since April's elections were called, which is the first of 2 consecutive elections, and that was back in December, Netanyahu has remained prime minister. Certainly, he doesn't have a functioning government. It is a transitional government, but he is prime minister. And as long as this process of elections continues, and it looks like we're on our way to a 3rd election, probably sometime in March, Netanyahu remains prime minister. And I'll go back to an earlier point, which means the House committee which decides on parliamentary immunity cannot be formed, which means Netanyahu cannot make that request, which means the legal proceeding against Netanyahu and the formal indictment cannot yet proceed. So he is, for now, protected by his position as prime minister, and Israel's political deadlock looks like it could be working in his favor.
So clearly this political deadlock continues. We're going to most likely see a 3rd election. We've already had 2 elections in less than a year. How do you think Benny Gantz is going to read all of this as it plays out today?
Former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz made it one of his key campaign promises, perhaps the key campaign promise, that he wouldn't sit with a prime minister who was under criminal investigation, and certainly not at this point a prime minister facing criminal indictment. Does it change his position? No. If anything, it only hardens it. The question is, can Gantz get any members of the Likud to cross over, or any members of the other right-wing or religious Zionist or ultra-Orthodox parties to cross over and support him? That answer at this point looks like probably not, meaning Israel's political deadlock continues. But that will be what Gantz will try to do, try to convince some of those on the right wing, some of those who've essentially pledged loyalty to Netanyahu, who have supported Netanyahu, that now that he's facing criminal indictment, it's time to move on. It's time to support another candidate for prime minister. And let's not forget, Gantz's party emerged the largest from the last elections. His blue and white party had 1 more seat than Netanyahu's Likud party. But like Netanyahu, Gantz couldn't form a government, and the deadlock continues.
So, Oren, just bring us up to speed, remind our viewers of the cases, the corruption cases, which began December 2016, 3 years ago, against Netanyahu, and the charges that he is set to face when we hear from the Attorney General in less than an hour.
We'll walk through these cases one by one, and this started as a preliminary examination years ago. It then became a larger, essentially more formal and more serious criminal investigation, and that was nearly 3 years ago, and that led to this point. Along that way, there was a police recommendation. Police do the investigation work. They look at the evidence they have and make a recommendation to prosecutors. Prosecutors then look at that evidence again and decide on which of those charges that police have recommended they will proceed on. That crucial statement came in February when the Attorney General said he would pursue charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust in case 4000, and then fraud and breach of trust in case 2000 and 1000. There was a pre-indictment hearing where Netanyahu's legal team tried to get some of the cases dismissed or closed, or at least the charge of bribery thrown out. But at this point, with the statement we have now, we know that the Attorney General will charge, pending the legal and procedural process here, that Attorney General will charge Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust in one case, and then fraud and breach of trust in 2 other cases. A major blow to Netanyahu, who has insisted all along he's innocent.
All right, Oren Libermann in Jerusalem, if you can stand by for us. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to continue with this breaking news coverage of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. Stay with us, you're watching CNN.
The world needs to know Brazil by Brazil. We believe in sustainability, preserving over 60% of our native vegetation. We have the world's most impressive biodiversity, with over 100,000 animal species and 40,000 plant species. Over 70% of our energy sources are clean and renewable through hydroelectric, solar, and wind power, with aggressive growth plans. Meet a new Brazil that is committed to renewable energy. Meet Brazil by Brazil.
He made history this year in Japan as the first black man to captain his team to victory at the 2019 Rugby World Cup. South Africa Springboks captain Siya Kolisi. This month on Talk Asia, we look back at his path to triumph in Yokohama.
I just think it was obviously me not giving up and training as hard as I could.
Talk Asia, Saturday on CNN. Feast on this. There's a fine dining frenzy underway in Budapest. Wander through the wilderness and forage in the forests with the city's Michelin star chefs to find the culinary treasures inspiring gastronomical masterpieces. And let them eat cake. Inside the coffee house that fed a literary movement. That's Feast on Budapest, Saturday on CNN.
We are following breaking news on Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set to face charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust within the coming hour. I want to bring in now Yonah Bob, who is the intelligence, terrorism and legal analyst for the Jerusalem Post. Certainly, this is a major development for Israel's Prime Minister, who, of course, is the longest-serving leader there. Give us a sense of the reaction so far as we're just starting to learn about these charges.
Listen, this is the worst-case scenario, right? This is bribery. It could have been breach of public trust. I think everybody expected an indictment today, but nobody in Israel, even the lawyers, know what breach of public trust really means. Something about conflict of interest. Bribery is something that politically sounds like a quid pro quo. It sounds really bad even to your average Israeli. And in terms of the Israeli Supreme Court, if somebody makes a petition now to force Netanyahu out of office, the Israeli Supreme Court itself might force him out even if he doesn't want to go. That's the big difference between bribery and breach of trust. This was his worst case scenario. The other thing that really hits him is there's another case called Case 2000, where they thought that maybe he wouldn't be indicted at all, and he's being indicted in that case also. Basically, you've got two cases of media bribery that look like a pattern of Netanyahu trying to own the media in Israel, and you have another case of being accused of receiving illegal gifts. As a general picture, again, Netanyahu's worst case scenario.
So those cases you mentioned, Case 2000, that was over Netanyahu's alleged deal with a newspaper for favourable coverage. Just tell us a little bit more about that case, Case 2000.
Sure. So Case 2000 was between the owner of Yediot Achronot, which is one of the two largest newspapers in Israel. And basically he said, look, if you get your friend, Sheldon Adelson, who owns Israel Hayom, to be less competitive with me in certain ways, print a little bit less on the weekends, hand out fewer newspapers for free, a bunch of things like that, I will give you positive coverage in Yediot Achronot. Netanyahu always was sore that he never got positive coverage in Yediot Achronot. Some people have said, Moshe Lador, former chief prosecutor, had said something like this could be worth $1 billion. It could win somebody an election, even if it wasn't money, to become prime minister. That's Case 2000. Case 4000 involved another news media outlet, Walla, which is one of the largest news websites in Israel. There you had Shaul Elovitch, who owned that website, and Netanyahu basically got positive coverage. The Attorney General says systematically positive coverage on the Walla website in exchange for using his power as communications minister to get money for that same man, Shaul Elovitch, who owned this giant telecommunications company called Bezek.
And Case 1000, that of course is the breach of trust issue over allegations that he took gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from businessmen who, in order to promote essentially their interests.
That's right. So you have Arnon Milchan, who's a tycoon and billionaire, is the main figure here. You also have James Packer, another billionaire involved at some point, but most of it is about Milchan. And basically the idea is you have Milchan asking Netanyahu to help him to get a visa involving the U.S. Secretary of State. You have Netanyahu getting helicopter rides with the army in order to have Milchan have special meetings with foreign officials. You have allegations that Netanyahu tried to pass bills to reduce taxes for Milchan. Now, at the end of the day, most of these things didn't happen the same way. That in case 4000, the bribery actually happened, according to the Attorney General. In case 1000, because some of the deals that Netanyahu wasn't maybe able to fully work out for Milchin, that's why it's not bribery and breach of trust. But the Attorney General still said you still did all sorts of actions in a conflict of interest situation, receiving gifts that you shouldn't have received. That's breach of trust.
Right. Okay. Yonah Bob, we're going to leave it there for now. From the Jerusalem Post, good to have you with us. We will come back to you again soon, no doubt. We are, of course, covering that breaking news. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set to face charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.